This film tells the story of a 17-year-old boy who is very enthusiastic to join the war with his school friends. But when the war began, their mentality immediately became shriveled by witnessing the real atrocities of war. Okay, without further ado, let's jump straight into the storyline, but before that, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell. The story begins in the First World War, seen a great war that took place in a trench between Germany and France to seize territory. But one of the troops named Heinrich had to die. After the war, the surviving soldiers began to collect the bodies of the dead German soldiers, and they took their uniforms to be washed of bloodstains and sewn back to give to new troops. Introducing our main character, a 17-year-old boy named Paul Ballmer. It was seen that Paul and his friends were very enthusiastic about registering as soldiers to join the war to defend their country, namely Germany. Paul enlisted in the army secretly without his parents knowing. He even faked his parents' hands on the registration form. Then Paul and other young people were motivated by the head of the German army registrar so that they were all enthusiastic about participating in the war.
In den dunkelsten Stunden wird es dort draußen auch vor Gott und Vaterland. Ja!
Paul and his friends finally managed to register and this time of year got a uniform from a previously killed soldier named Heinrich. They were all very enthusiastic and eager to go to war because they thought that if they were soldiers the girls would approach and think they looked cool. Long story short, Paul and other new soldiers immediately departed with minimal training and used uniforms from soldiers who had died before. In the middle of the journey, Paul and his entourage were forced to walk because their lift truck had to be used to bring the wounded soldiers back to base. The group of soldiers was attacked by the French, but the attack did not last long and the group immediately continued their journey to the Western Front, which was at war. Long story short, they reached the ditch. It looks like the situation there is still chaotic plus very heavy rain, which makes some soldiers have to drain the trench so it doesn't flood. That night Paul and his friends were on duty on guard, but Paul saw something moving in front of him and shot him straight away. However, due to the reflection of light from Paul's helmet, Paul was hit by a shot on his helmet. Luckily Paul's helmet was strong enough to withstand the bullets that shot. Then the French troops fired flares. It turned out that the flare was assigned to bomb the German trenches and make the German troops immediately take cover in the bunker. In the midst of a bomb attack, one of Paul's friends named Ludwig, who was initially very enthusiastic, was immediately mentally crushed when he learned of the cruelty of the war, and he asked to go home. But the French attack managed to knock down the blood bunker and Paul didn't have time to get out. The next morning Paul was found by his friends and survived in a pile of wood. After last night's attack, a lot of soldiers died and Paul was told to collect the badges of the dead soldiers. But unfortunately he found Ludwig, who had died from last night's attack. It made Paul very sad. Then, because of starvation, Paul and a war veteran named Kat went to a farm in search of food. But when Kat entered, he was caught, but he also managed to get a goose and immediately ran away. Arriving at the camp, they immediately cooked the goose. Paul and his friends were very happy because they could eat meat in the midst of this very cruel war. After eating, they relax and talk to each other, planning their respective plans when the war is over. Not long after, Kat got a letter from his wife, who couldn't read, asking Paul to read her letter. Turns out to contain a love letter from his wife so that he returns safely. Then Paul and his friends were on duty for patrol and they found several corpses of soldiers whose bodies had been crushed and stuck in trees due to the explosion. They finally arrived at the armory but were surprised to find many German soldiers killed by poison gas attacks. That night when Paul was asleep, Suddenly they got a call to return to the trenches to prepare for a truce there. They immediately headed for the trench to get ready for war. On the other hand, the head of the German delegation named Matthias tried to make peace with the French so that the war would not continue. Because they are only fighting to seize territory, which is a small area, and the struggle for that area takes a lot of casualties, soldiers and civilians. The French agreed, but with some conditions the Germans had to fulfill, and the war would continue until Matthias agreed to the French terms. Matthias immediately sent Francis's requirements to German officials whether it was approved or not.
Ich bitte Sie den Waffenstillstand.
Alors signé.
The war in the vanguard finally broke out. German troops attacked the French troops on the other side. The German troops who had arrived at the enemy's place immediately killed all the French soldiers until there were none left. After all the French troops were wiped out, Paul and his friends took the enemy's food and also ate it because the food was part of a war step. But the fun didn't last long because French reinforcements came using bulletproof tanks. German troops tried to fire on the tank, but it was in vain. The arrival of the tank made the German troops nervous and decided to withdraw. Many of the retreating German soldiers had to be killed by being fired upon by French tanks from behind. Paul, who will resign, must part with his one friend named Franz. The German troops who were still in the trenches also had to die horribly because they were burned by the French troops. Paul, together with Krog and Kat, managed to subvert one French tank by bombing the inside of the tank. Paul then immediately ran back to the trench. Arriving in the trench, he saw Krog, who had been surrounded by French troops, and finally he had to be burned to death. There was no time to be sad. He immediately ran, carrying bullets and other equipment. However, he had to take cover in a hole due to an attack from a French plane. When he was about to leave, he was too late because the French were already around the hole. Before long, there were French troops who were going to kill Paul. Paul quickly stabbed his enemy until he was helpless. He kept waiting for the French troops to leave, and finally Paul felt guilty because he saw his enemy dying in front of him. But in the end he had to die because of the many stabs he had received. After waiting, Matthias finally got a message from his superiors to immediately sign a peace treaty with France. Matthias and his colleagues as representatives of Germany finally signed a peace letter, and the agreement takes effect on the 11th of the month 11 at 11 a.m. It indicates before that hour the war is still going on. Felt the area was safe, Paul immediately returned to the camp with many corpses around him. When they arrived at the camp, everyone was very happy because they were going home to meet their respective families. Paul, who was in the camp, met his friend who had separated named Jaden. Jaden was injured during the attack in the trench, which left his leg badly injured. Jaden also informed that Franz was dead. This made Paul very sad because all of his school friends had died. He then went to the kitchen to get some food. There he met Kat, who was still alive, and the two of them immediately took food for themselves and also for Jaden. While eating, it turned out that Jaden committed suicide by stabbing himself with a fork because he had no other purpose, because he would become a disabled person. Paul and Kat, who tried to help, were unsuccessful because Jaden had lost a lot of blood. Paul felt peaceful in the morning because it was the first time he had a very quiet morning. The two of them who were still hungry went back to the previous farmhouse. After arriving at the destination, it was Paul's turn to take food while Kat would watch around. At first Paul took the goose eggs very calmly, but unfortunately he was caught by a small child and immediately locked the door. Paul immediately ran away while being fired upon by the farmer, and they both finally managed to escape. Felt safe, they both immediately eat the eggs raw to prop up the stomach.
Besser geht's nicht.
Kat then went into the woods to urinate, but suddenly from behind the little boy came and shot Kat directly into the stomach. Paul, who heard the gunshots, immediately entered the forest and helped Kat. They both then decided to return to the camp to treat Kat. On the way they met a group of German soldiers, but the group did not want to stop even though Paul had asked for help.
Anhalten!
Paul was forced to carry Kat all the way to camp. Arriving at the camp, the doctor said that Kat had died of poisoning because the bullet that hit Kat had been poisoned. Again, Paul had to lose the people closest to him. Then the general gathered all the soldiers in the field. He told if they had to fight once again to seize the territory. Soldiers who were initially happy about going home became sad because they didn't go home. The other soldiers inevitably had to fight once more because if they refused they would be killed. Long story short, the German troops secretly approached the enemy trenches, but the enemy realized their existence and finally the war broke out. This time Paul had to fight alone because he didn't know anyone anymore. Paul, who saw the young soldier, immediately helped him, and finally Paul fought with his bare hands against a French soldier. Paul initially was cornered, but he quickly hit the enemy on the head with a rock. The fight still continues, which makes them both go into the bunker. Inside, the unconscious Paul was finally stabbed from behind until the knife penetrated his chest. Paul, who was dying, came out of the bunker and found both sides had stopped fighting because it was already 11 o'clock, indicating Germany and France had made peace. The scene changes to the young soldier who was previously helped by Paul. Because the soldier was new, he was ordered to collect the identification marks of the soldiers who died. Just like Paul, when walking along the trench he met Paul, who had died because his heart had rotted. And the film ends with Paul's death and peace being established. Those are the storylines of the film All Quiet on the Western Front, guys. A war film that shows us how cruel it was during the First World War. If you are a war movie lover, this film is definitely a must for you to watch. For those of you who like channels about film storylines, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so that you get the latest video notifications from this channel. That's all, and see you soon.